From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's ahead from the Livestock Marketing Information Center. Katelyn McCullock is featured on this week's Cattle Market segment. Katelyn will go over the LMIC's updated projections on cattle feeding returns for the rest of 2020. Then highlights from the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. They'll look at two topics this time around: the factors that lead to cows giving birth to twins and preparing those bulls for the upcoming breeding season. Taking part in the conversation, K-State's Bob Larson, Brad White, and Bob Weaber. And on this week's 4-H segment, K-State's Beth Hinshaw talks with Jeff Wickman about 4-H'ers reassessing their project goals. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Thanks for tuning in for this Agriculture Today. For our look at the cattle markets this time around, we'll turn to the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, based in Denver. Katelyn McCullock is with us now to talk about another tumultuous week in the cattle trades, Katelyn, and there was a really decent surge in cash-fed cattle and the futures as well. That's cooled off the last few trading sessions, and so the question arises naturally, has the market topped, at least for the moment?
That's a great question, Eric. And the rally in fed cattle prices has largely been in response to the huge jump we saw in the box beef cutout in last week. It's our feeling that retailers are backfilling empty meat cases and having quite a bit of demand related to panic buying due to coronavirus, causing a lot of people to feel like they may be isolated or quarantined for quite some time in their houses. Now, how long that lasts, I think, is a great question. In my mind, I'm not sure we can sell the meat case every single week, and so maybe some of this backs off once folks have a freezer full of food and need some time to kind of work through that. Now, with that being said, I don't think it's completely taken over the whole country. Different cities are in different points of this virus, leading to shut-in type behavior. Some folks are still able to move out and about fairly freely, but a lot of stop movement type orders have gone into effect in major cities, as well as cancellations of large gatherings. And so I'm not sure how much it'll continue, but I don't think the box beef cutout is likely to hold, which means fed cattle prices aren't likely to hold either. So we may remain at these levels for a few weeks, but I think heading into the next quarter, you're going to see fed cattle prices come precipitously down over the next 2 quarters, probably.
So much indefinite about this, though. We're really in uncharted waters, Katelyn, in as far as beef consumption patterns. So it is really difficult to foretell what's going to happen here with any kind of certainty.
Yeah, so we're looking at this from a couple of perspectives. We do have large amounts of meat on the market right now. The first quarter for beef is going to come in 6% above a year ago. For pork, it's closer to over 7%, and for broiler production, it's going to be closer to over 8% above a year ago. And so that's a lot of meat on the market. And when we're talking about food service industries closing, restaurants, bars, etc., and how much of that consumption is going to be made up at home through grocery store sales, they're probably not a one-for-one change. We do expect some of that to be offset through grocery store sales, but probably not all of it. The other factor of competing meats is going to become a much bigger impact and issue moving forward as consumers find they have less income either due to quick cut hours. Some folks have lost their jobs completely. And beef is still relatively expensive compared to pork and chicken. Now, beef, I would say, is probably not expensive in the history of retail beef prices. But when you're talking about such big unknowns moving forward about the U.S. economy and what's going to happen with your health and other jobs, the tendency to tighten your belt is a very normal type of reaction. And we might start to see that show up in the meat case after this initial wave of buying passes.
as you mentioned the supply side of it, let's spend just a few moments more on that. The USDA put out new cold storage figures. It also released its quarterly hogs and pigs report this past week. You might quickly summarize those two reports and just what they mean to the cattle sector.
So the cold storage report was as of the end of February, and one thing it's going to point to is that even though grocery stores sold at higher volumes than they had the year before, we still saw cold storage build. So as I mentioned before, that offset between at-home consumption and losing maybe more out-of-home consumption, we didn't end up consuming all of that at home. So we still ended up building cold storage. Beef cuts climbed over 20% over a year ago, while boneless beef climbed only 3%. Pork in cold storage was up 7%, but bellies, loins, bone-in picnics were all over 25% above a year ago. And there were smaller increases in butts, trimmings, and variety meats, but they were all over 5%. When we look at lamb and mutton, those increased 7% above last year and 3% higher than the month before. Turkey inventory is 25% below a year ago, and total chicken in cold storage is about 7% ahead of last year.
As for the hogs and pigs report on the production side, leading to indicators on pork supply, what did it have to say?
So there were several interesting things that came out of the hogs and pigs report. One of the keys is this pigs per litter number has continued to post very strong gains, close to 3% in the last 3 or 4 quarters, and this report was no different. Pigs per litter was up 2.8% and risen to about 11 pigs per litter. In terms of fairings and total hogs, all hogs and pigs were up 4% above a year ago. That was pretty close to what the pre-report estimate said. Hogs kept for breeding were only up 0.4%, so a little bit smaller than what the industry expected ahead of the report. But hogs kept for marketing rose 4.3%, and that's a fairly big number when we're looking at already large supplies of hogs. And so what that means is that early on in 2020, we're likely to see larger production numbers as those hogs get fed out and come to market. So you're looking at probably a 6-month window from anything born here in the first quarter. But what was notable maybe is that any farrowing intentions moving forward seem to have been pulled back in from maybe where we would have thought they were a couple of months ago. The March through May figure, so that's roughly the next quarter, is expected to be only slightly below a year ago, but the June through August farrowing intentions right now are expected to be over 4% below a year ago. And those are numbers that really lead me to believe that producer sentiment is no longer very optimistic, and
right,
that they believe that they're likely going to lose money on these hogs. And so that's a pretty big change from where we were last year when we were talking about African swine fever and the large demand for protein that was expected for this year. You can see that outlook has really done a 180 here in the last 4 weeks.
So the LMIC has put out its latest projected cattle feeding returns, and what was once optimistic for 2020 has quickly turned quite the opposite, hasn't it, Katelyn?
I already mentioned that hogs have done a 180. I would say cattle feeding is in a similar boat heading into 2020. 2 or 3 months ago, we were looking at fairly strong gains for cattle feeding returns in the first half of 2020. We're looking at most of the second and third quarter posting huge losses for cattle feeding. Now, the one good thing is that we're expecting corn and the feed side to come down, but that's not going to be able to offset the declines we're expecting in fed cattle prices. And so it's going to be a tough time for cattle feeding in 2020. We may be able to see some positive feeding returns by the fourth quarter, but it's still very much up in the air until we see more about what this virus is going to do to the economy and what it's going to do to beef demand.
How bad is bad when we look at those margins then?
We're calculating something, more than $100 per head, depending on how ugly it gets moving forward. As you said, there's a lot of uncertainty in this market, so I don't want to be too specific, but we're looking at substantial losses. Now, our assumption is that there isn't any hedging involved in this, and so there may be some opportunities, but I think in this sort of very volatile market, those hedging opportunities may not exist, and so it's going to be a rough couple of quarters for cattle feeding.
And will the difficulties filter down to the cow-calf level as well?
So cow-calf country is actually expected to have a slightly better year than last year, but 2019, according to what we pencil out, was probably the worst cow-calf return since 1996. It was also the second year in a row where folks probably lost some money. And so from that perspective, 2020 should be better than 2019, but we probably won't know that till the end of the year. So our cow-calf calculations heavily rely on year-end sales of those fall-weaned calves. And so what we're penciling in right now is that those prices are probably not going to see as big of a decline as some of the other ones. But again, it's all about timing. How is beef demand by the time we get to this end of this year? What does that look like for the cow-calf producers? So right now we're thinking that calf prices are still going to be above a year ago in the fourth quarter. But until we get closer, I think there's quite a bit of unknown around that range. The other thing we're looking at is cull cow values. Pretty low the last year and a half. We're thinking those are going to boost back up. One of the very friendly family meal items, easy to cook, goes well on the grill, can make it into a variety of options, is ground beef. And I think there's some real opportunity for those cull cow values to come back up. Now, the price chart hasn't looked very good the last couple weeks. So 90% lean, which is a lot of those cull cows, has come down since the January highs, but they were at fairly high values. So moving forward, I think there's still some room for volatility, but overall we're expecting an annual average to be better than last year, and that'll help out those cow-calf returns as well.
All right. And that the country is battened down. In closing, it's just what you're hinting at there, Katelyn. Producers are going to have to sharpen their management to adapt to the current circumstances.
Yes, Eric, I think producers will do well to run through a few scenarios on their ranch and what that looks like moving forward. It's going to be a difficult time. There's things you can predict, there's things you can't predict. But if you look at worst, middle, and best case scenario, that might be a good place to start.
Well, Katelyn, we appreciate the input on all of this, and take care out Denver way. We will catch up with you again in a few weeks. Many thanks for your comment.
Thank you.
Katelyn McCullock, the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, sponsored by K-State and numerous other land-grant universities. We'll be back on This Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, highlights from another Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. And the group this time doing their due diligence, meeting via video conference to maintain that element of social distancing. On board, veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson, along with cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber, getting into a couple of cow-calf management matters. Here's Brad.
We're going to address a listener question, and then we're going to spend some time talking about getting bulls ready, because it is that time of year that those bulls are getting ready to go to work, and we need to start planning for how they get ready for that. The question from the listener was related to twins, and specifically, why was one of them weaker than the other? And some of the twins, you won't see that they look equal when they come out. Sometimes one is weaker, sometimes one has trouble the first couple of days of life. The follow-up question, and I've received this from a couple different people, is why do we have twins so frequently? So, Bob, I'm going to ask you to start out with, let's think, what's the normal frequency of twins? And then we'll get into some of the other parts of the question.
Well, according to some of the USDA surveys across the U.S., the estimate is around 2% of pregnancies would be a twin pregnancy. When you say 2%, the other interesting thing is there's a lot we don't necessarily know about exactly all. I mean, we think we know what causes twins. It's either a double ovulation, so the cow ovulates 2 eggs, or less commonly, occasionally, an early embryo will split into 2. So that'd be your identical twins. So probably the question is, well, what causes cows to double ovulate? And as far as we know, there's some genetic components. Again, some cows and cow families are a little more prone to that. There may be some other factors, too, that we're not as aware of. And the reason I say that is I've got to look at some ranch data over many years from several ranches, and what you'll see is, you can get to that 2 or 3 or even 4% twins on one year, and the years surrounding it don't have anywhere near that many twins. And so I don't know if that's just weird luck that year, or if there's something temperature-wise, humidity. I'm just throwing out guesses. Something around the time of mating that causes more double ovulations. Maybe something, feed quality, or we really don't know. There may be some years where we run into more twins in some herds. So national average around 2%. It certainly isn't. If you're a herd and you're saying, well, we haven't had twins in years, that wouldn't surprise me. If you're a herd that said, we were running more than that, that wouldn't surprise me either.
And Bob, have you had twins in your herd that you've had to deal with?
Yeah, we haven't, fortunately, because they can be a real challenge managerially. You think through the challenges of potentially a dystocia. The other challenge is sometimes old mama cow, she's not expecting to, and so one of those calves oftentimes will get abandoned. And so making sure you've got a close monitoring in calving season can help save those twins that get rejected. Obviously, if you're in cold or really wet weather, their life expectancy is not very good if you don't capture them, make sure they've got colostrum and so forth.
Well, I think that gets directly to the listener question, and sometimes we talk about one of the twins being weaker than the other. And Bob, one of the things you didn't address, sometimes there's a double ovulation or there's a twin, and that twin never makes it to birth. So we don't really know the frequency of how often that happens. And because of that, I think at that time, you have to wonder, as some of them come out, she's not ready, as Bob said. So what else can we do when we have one of those that seems a little bit weaker?
Well, it really depends on the cause. One of the things, we talked about the placenta. That's the organ that allows nutrients to transfer from the cow to the calf. Well, just because there's 2 calves in there, that doesn't mean that each calf gets an equal placenta. So there's 2 different placentas, and so one may have much better attachments than the other. So one calf really may have gone throughout pregnancy with less nutrient transfer from its mother than the other. So they're not necessarily equally nourished during pregnancy. So that could be one reason that one is different than the other. The other is during the birth process itself, kind of depending on which one's where in the birth canal. One of them could have a relatively, normal stress birth, and the other could have a much more stressful birth process, which then would decrease its ability to really thrive. So there's several reasons why it's not uncommon for one of the twin in the pair to be much more rigorous and thrive better than the other one. What can we do about that? Well, basically, it's just good nursing care at birth. Keep, particularly if one of them is not doing well, keep it in a warm, dry environment. Maybe you have to tube feed it. May have to take it away from the mother. I'd love it if we could leave it with the mother and she'd take care of it, but you got to be aware if she's either not wanting to take it or really it's not thriving, we may have to do some more intensive care of that calf. But it's
make that decision sooner rather than later.
I think on the cow side, there's certainly likely an environmental impact of cow body condition score, recovery of body conditions. So if they were a little thin, maybe pre-calving, get into really good nutrition through the summer up to breeding can stimulate those cows to be extra fertile, if you will, and can play a role. So kind of watching particularly cows maybe that lost a calf that come into the fall and good body condition score might be risk candidates for twins.
One thing I would mention that we talk about sometimes, just remember, if it's a twin and it's a bull and it's a heifer, it is likely because of the exposure of testosterone in the uterine environment that heifer is not likely fertile and would be what we call a free martin. The other thing I want to talk, we're talking about calving, and we're going to switch right to talking about, let's get ready for breeding season, because it's that time of year and we're starting to think about it. And Bob, I want to ask you guys, what do we evaluate on our bulls to make sure they're ready for the breeding season?
Well, I think, first of all, it's really important to emphasize bulls' health, their fertility, make sure that they are absolutely critical in it. And the way I talk to veterinary students about it is, if I've got some of the cows that are a little thin and aren't as fertile as I'd like them, but most of the cows are in good shape, my breed up will be okay. If I have a situation where some of my bulls are not ready for the breeding season, my breed up can be very, very poor because, a single bull is going to be responsible for many pregnancies. It's critical that those bulls are ready to go into the breeding season healthy and fertile and ready to go. So I start with just kind of an overall health. Do they look like they're thriving? They're in a good body condition. They can, feet and legs are good. They can move out. They're healthy. You start with just, do they look like a breeding athlete ready to go into the breeding season?
So that includes their being in good shape, having the ability to move around easily. Bob, I wanted to ask you, because you guys sell bulls from the purebred unit here, and you have people take them to different environments. Does that change how they react, how they look? What do we need to look for there?
Yeah, I think, that environmental adaptation is really important, and we work pretty hard to make sure bulls are in good body condition score when they leave our sale facility. Bulls that are too thin or too over conditioned is typically more likely, more frequently the problem. They go in, somebody just kicks them out on dormant winter forage before green up here. Those bulls can struggle a little bit and lose some body condition score, and that can have sometimes a negative effect on both breeding performance but also semen quality. And so, taking care of those particularly yearling bulls as they go from sale time to pre-turnout is really critical. And, managing those bulls in terms of introduction to other bulls, particularly mature bulls, pre-turnout is really important. So you want to sort of introduce those guys so that they get along and sort of sort out the pecking order, but you can't just dump them out in the pasture and walk away. There's oftentimes bulls will get injured in the fight for dominance, and if there is a big tussle going on, human safety is really important, kind of like getting in the middle of a dogfight. You want to be real careful how you do that, but making sure those bulls are in a spot where potentially separate them if needed, if things get a little out of hand, and get them introduced and sort of settled out before you turn them out with cows, because you don't want them distracted from settling cows, having this big tournament to see who's king bull.
And one other thing that I didn't mention before, Brad, was we talk about having the bulls vaccinated well for the herd. And a lot of times what we look at is vaccinate bulls similarly to the females that are of the same age. So I typically vaccinate yearling bulls about like I would vaccinate yearling heifers. The one exception is heifers get a brucellosis vaccine and bulls do not. But other than that, similar, and same thing with the adult bulls. Vaccinate them the same way that you would vaccinate adult cows so that those bulls are healthy, ready to go into the breeding season, well vaccinated, in the correct body condition, and ready to be a breeding athlete.
And what about the breeding soundness exam, Bob?
Well, that's my favorite as the veterinarian. It really, and the breeding soundness exam includes some of the things we've talked about. It's a good physical exam, as well as evaluation of the reproductive tract, and also then a semen evaluation. And the reason we do that is we know that even healthy-looking bulls, a certain percentage of them, and the estimates are 10 to 20% of bulls would be subfertile. In other words, not get as many cows pregnant as we really need. And that breeding soundness exam is a good way to identify those bulls that are likely to perform poorly in the breeding season and not use them.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, Bob Weaber, Bob Larson, and Brad White. That Cattle Chat podcast in full can be accessed at beefcattleinstitute.org. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to our Monday edition of Agriculture Today. From the campus of Kansas State University, Eric Atkinson here. Now today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, on Friday, President Trump did sign into law that $2.2 trillion stimulus package dubbed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act after the House passed the bill earlier in the day. Agriculture is among the industries with aid set aside, including providing the USDA $14 billion more in funding authority under the Commodity Credit Corporation. That allows the department to craft an aid package to producers who have seen commodity prices fall since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Agricultural groups representing various commodities had praised Congress for crafting the legislation earlier in the week, recognizing how grains, livestock, and specialty crops had all been affected in different ways by the economic shutdown caused by the virus. The legislation includes a $9.5 billion assistance program more directly supporting livestock operations, including dairy producers, as well as specialty crop producers. Farmers who sell directly to farmers markets, schools, and restaurants would also be eligible for aid. And the bill includes $15.5 billion for the USDA's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and USDA rural development programs would receive $25 billion for distance learning and telemedicine programs, lawmakers citing the value in boosting telemedicine as a way to treat patients without possibly spreading the disease for people who do not need hospitalization. Another $100 million would also go to further boost rural broadband as well. With the announcement that Governor Laura Kelly issued that statewide stay-home order, the Kansas Department of Agriculture stated that food and agriculture businesses must keep a strong focus on their essential functions and follow safety protocols. The governor's Kansas Essential Function Framework, outlined in the executive order, clearly identifies food and agriculture businesses as essential functions that are exempt from the stay-home order. The KDA will continue to provide support and guidance to those businesses as needed, but urges all of those in the food and agriculture industry to scrutinize their activities and staffing and limit those to those which are essential to the food supply chain, to public health and safety and protection of animal health and welfare. The KDA is reminding those food and agriculture businesses that while they continue to operate, they must, to the extent possible, use telework capabilities to avoid meeting in person if possible. Any essential functions being performed on site or in person must, to the extent possible, follow appropriate safety protocols, including maintaining that 6-foot distance between individuals and limiting gatherings to fewer than 10 people. Amidst the COVID-19 disruptions, the USDA is adding more flexibilities for producers in dealing with crop insurance providers. Here's the USDA's Gary Crawford with more.
This week, Undersecretary of Agriculture Bill Northey said that in the wake of all that's going on with the COVID-19 situation and such,
we will continue to look to figure out if there's flexibilities to be able to help producers.
And the latest example of that coming from the USDA's Risk Management Agency, its administrator, Martin Barbary, announced Friday a series of flexibilities that will allow the approved crop insurance providers to continue to work with producers on insurance matters. First, in order to reduce person-to-person contact as much as possible, producers will be allowed now to send notifications and reports electronically. USDA is going to give producers more time for production reports to be submitted and for premiums to be paid. Also, RMA is deferring interest on unpaid premiums and other payments. Farmers are urged to call or email their insurance agent to get all of the details on this. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And do want to bring to your attention once more a series of online gatherings that are being conducted by the Agricultural Economics Department here at Kansas State University on the economics of agriculture during the COVID-19 pandemic. These started this past Thursday, and they'll continue in the following Thursdays over the next 3 weeks. These are providing K-State Research and Extension agricultural economists and their input, and they'll be available to answer questions about many topics. You can expect a short presentation at each of these, then discussions, and then the opportunity to discuss and ask questions. Now, the latest in this series will be this coming Thursday, April the 2nd. K-State's Dan O'Brien, whom you hear every Friday here in this broadcast, will be taking a look at the grain markets and planting intentions, and amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, what the effects of that are. That'll start at 7 o'clock this Thursday evening. There's no fee for participating, but registration is required. For that registration is limited to 300 people. There will be recordings posted on the Ag Manager website following each session, by the way. When you do register, you can feel free to submit your questions you'd like addressed in the space provided on the registration, and you can take care of that at agmanager.info, agmanager.info. Again, a series of online gatherings on the economics of agriculture during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dan O'Brien of K-State up to bat on this Thursday, April the 2nd, 7 o'clock, and you can find out more at agmanager.info. Check this series out. On now to this week's edition of Tree Tales with K-State Forester, Charlie Barden. Charlie?
Well, spring is finally here, and with the daffodils and hyacinths in full bloom and the tulips are well on their way. And the threatened response to the COVID-19 virus is looming over almost everything we do, from closing schools and restaurants to banning any large gatherings of people. If you've been cooped up inside for a few days, now is a great time to go for a walk in the woods. Maintaining your exercise habits helps keep your immune system strong, too. Just be sure to avoid crowds and maintain that 6-foot social distance from others. Later in April, the wild plum and redbud will be in bloom, soon to be followed by the buckeye and wild cherry. Looking down, you will see a multitude of wildflowers growing and blooming. Most woodland flowers grow and bloom before the tree leaves have fully expanded to shade them, while their open prairie counterparts bloom during the summer. When we get a good soaking April rain, it will be prime time to go look for edible morel mushrooms. These delicacies are usually found in streamside woodlands under elm and cottonwood trees. Be sure to hunt them with an experienced morel picker for the first time you go, and don't eat any mushrooms without confirming it is a safe species. So this spring, go for a walk in the woods. If it is a windy day, be alert for broken branches still left hanging from the winter storms. These will continue to break loose and fall and could be hazardous. Be warned also that the ticks will be getting active as temperatures warm up, and mosquitoes too, so take precautions with clothing or repellent to protect yourself from becoming a treat for the local bug population. You've been listening to Tree Tales. I'm Charles Barden of Forest with K-State Research and Extension.
All right, Charlie, many thanks. And this is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. As we all continue to adjust to lifestyle changes caused by COVID-19, Kansas 4-H youth are being encouraged to continue working on their current 4-H projects. Think about other project areas to explore in the future, and to find ways to stay connected to their project leaders, and club members. Southeast Area Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist Beth Hinshaw says that this is also a good time for 4-H youth to revisit the Setting Project Goal Sheet on the Kansas 4-H website and to reassess their goals as well as what they want to learn and accomplish. Beth, this is one of those crazy situations where it's not spring break and you're not able to get together with your group. This is something that may stretch several weeks, maybe even months. How can youth stay somewhat in contact with their project leaders? And if they don't have a project leader, what are some things that they can do now to keep their projects moving forward?
Jeff, I think that's a really great thing for us to be thinking about right now. And probably one of the first things that we want to know is, do you have a piece of curriculum? There's actually a list of the different curriculum that are suggested for projects on the Kansas 4-H website. Certainly, some of those things can be ordered online. Other things we may have to wait for, as offices are closed and those kinds of things. But I would like to think back to this fall. My colleague Amy Solik was on, and she talked about using the Setting Project Goals sheet that's on the Kansas 4-H website. And I think that's a good thing to reassess right now. What are your goals in your project? It's important to plan out, what you want to learn and accomplish, what new skills you want to gain, and who's going to actually be able to help you. And so maybe this year, kind of like what you said, we might have a little more time to do some things this year. So maybe this year it's time to really challenge yourself with a bigger or a more complex project. Maybe this year you really want to perfect something that you're working in your project. And maybe this year you can find some really innovative ways to share your project or to lead others in what you've learned.
I'm thinking that a lot of the project areas, especially if you're in animals or if you're doing photography, some of the other things, there are probably a lot of things that you can at least practice on your own.
Oh, exactly. And so that would definitely be probably one of the first steps, when you're kind of planning out, okay, what can I do in this project, is what can you self-study or practice by yourself? And so that might mean reading about it, researching about it, or actually practicing. And I would just encourage everybody to think about taking some notes and reflecting on what you've done and what you want to try differently that next time. But there's a number of 4-H projects that, if you have a few supplies at your house, and you probably do because you were interested in that, you can certainly be practicing right now.
You can certainly get out and take photographs. You can go off by yourself. As long as you're staying away from other people, there's things that you can do.
Oh, most definitely. And when you think about all of the different project areas that we have in Kansas 4-H, and we have more than 30 projects, there's no reason why we can't be practicing on our clothing and textiles project, or certainly any of the animals that we already have. And if we don't have our animals yet, we could certainly be planning for that, or cleaning out a space for them so that we're ready for when they arrive. Foods and nutrition, I've seen some great things online with kids practicing all kinds of different foods and nutrition types of projects while they've been home.
Yeah, we talk about the spark and the passion, and really this is an opportunity to spend some of those idle hours doing the things that you love.
Exactly. And that spark is just kind of that first step of that project pathway. And so, there are things that you enjoy, and isn't it great that we've got some time to do those things right now? The other thing, besides just doing those things by yourself, is, what can you do with your family? Your family can be a good support to you in what you do with your project. They always have been a good support. And so be thinking about the steps that you can do at home with your family with those projects as well. One of the other things that I would say is, do you know a resource person? We may not be able to see some of our typical resource people, like our project leader if we had one, or maybe there's somebody else that, we go to with some issues with one of the projects that we have, but we can call them on the phone, kind of the old-fashioned thing, or you might even be able to have a video chat with them to show them what you've made, or to show them exactly what a problem is that you're having and see if they can't help you with that.
I know that the youth are probably more familiar with some of these things than I am, but there's FaceTime, there's Zoom, there's a lot of Facebook things that they can do. So there may be some ways for them to still kind of interact, maybe not as an entire club, but at least a few individuals.
Most definitely. And I think one of the things that's really important at this time is to stay connected. So stay connected to those other young people in your 4-H club or the other leaders in your 4-H club.
You mentioned the goal-setting sheet, and that can be found on the 4-H website?
Yes, it is right there under what's hot. And so we definitely want folks to go and look at that. And the other thing that I would say is, we've got some good time for planning right now. We're not going to be home forever. And so be thinking about what kind of field trips do you want to take when you can get out there and do that? What kind of judging contests do you want to take part in? Are there some people in the industry that you would like to interview because you think this might become a career path to you? Also, what kind of project evaluation? Maybe that's your fair, maybe it's taking it to a project leader or somebody else to look at it with you. And while a lot of those things we might be able to do right now via technology, make some plans for some in-person kinds of things that you'll do as well.
I like the idea of just staying busy, staying engaged, and like you said, staying connected as best you can.
Most definitely. We know that our 4-H friends often are our lifelong friends, so what a great time to continue to build those relationships.
That's Southeast Area Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist Beth Hinshaw, discussing the importance of continuing to work on current 4-H projects, reassessing project goals, including what they want to learn and accomplish with those project areas, and what projects they'd like to be involved with in the future. To learn more about all of the project areas offered by Kansas 4-H, visit their website, kansas4h.org, kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.